Welcome to another deep dive. Okay, so get this. In India today, the wealthiest 10,000 individuals hold an average wealth that's over 16,000 times greater than the average Indian. That's not a typo, 16,000. So how did we get here? Well, we're about to unpack a century of economic data to understand how income and wealth inequality in India evolved into what some are calling the Billionaire Raj. Our guide is this fascinating working paper, Income and Wealth Inequality in India, 1922 to 2023. The Rise of the Billionaire Raj by economists Nitin Kumar Bharti, Lucas Chancel, Thomas Piketty, and Anmal Samanchi. They've combined a century of data. National income accounts, tax records, household surveys, even those Forbes billionaire rankings.
It's an incredible undertaking that allows us to trace the flow of wealth and income from the British Raj to the present day. And as you hinted, the story is full of twists and turns, especially when we compare India's journey to other Asian economies.
Okay, you've got me hooked. Let's rewind to 1960 and look at India's average income growth. The paper describes a pretty volatile period until the mid-1970s, followed by solid growth in the 80s and 90s, but here's where it gets interesting.
Yeah, if we compare India to China and Vietnam during that same period, we see a real divergence. Until about 1975, their average incomes were pretty similar, but then China and Vietnam just took off. In fact, China's average income is now 2.5 times greater than India's.
Wow, 2.5 times. That's a huge difference.
Oh.
It makes you wonder what factors contributed to such a gap.
Well, the paper highlights several potential factors, including differences in economic policies and, crucially, investments in health and education. China and Vietnam consistently prioritize those areas, arguably laying the groundwork for stronger long-term economic performance.
It makes you think about the long-term impact of prioritizing human capital. But for now, let's bring our focus back to India's economic narrative. We know that along with growth, we've seen the rise of some incredibly wealthy individuals. The number of Indian billionaires has just exploded.
It's a dramatic rise. And it's not just the number of billionaires, it's the proportion of wealth they hold. The combined wealth of these billionaires as a share of India's national income has gone from less than 1% in 1991 to a staggering 25% in 2022.
25%, that's a quarter of the entire national income. That figure makes me wonder if everyone has benefited equally from India's economic growth or if there's a deeper story here.
That's exactly the question the researchers explore, and that's where the data gets really fascinating.
Let's unpack that story, starting with income inequality. The paper tracks the top 1% income share in India over the past century, and the trends are pretty wild.
Imagine a roller coaster. That's what the top 1% income share looks like over the past 100 years. It peaked at over 20% in the 1930s before plummeting during the 1940s. Then from the 1950s to the 1980s, we see a steady decline, most likely due to the socialist policies of that era.
So during the time, the richest were actually getting a smaller slice of the pie, but then, as you said, there's a twist it.
Right, the 1990s see a sharp turnaround with economic liberalization policies. The top 1% income share starts climbing again, and it hasn't stopped since.
By 2022, that share reached a record high of 22.6%, placing India among the countries with the highest income inequality in the world. But the study doesn't just stop there. It zooms in even further, looking at inequality within the top 1%, the top 0.1%, 0.01%, even 0.001%.
And what they found is that the concentration of income gets even more pronounced at those very top levels. The richest of the rich are pulling away from even the rest of the 1%.
Okay, so we've got a picture of growing income inequality, especially at the very top, but I'm also thinking about everyone else. What's happening with the bottom 50% and the middle 40% of earners in India?
That's where we see another interesting trend reversal. Until the 2000s, the middle 40% actually held a larger share of the national income than the top 10%. But that's completely flipped now.
So the middle class is actually shrinking. What's driving that trend?
Well, the paper points to several factors. One is the rising role of what's called capital income. As the wealthy accumulate more wealth, they also earn more from their investments, which further widens the gap.
It sounds like a bit of a snowball effect. The more you have, the more you gain.
Exactly. And there's another factor tied to the manufacturing sector. Essentially, a larger portion of the profits generated in manufacturing is going to the owners of capital, rather than to workers' wages. This trend is likely contributing to the growing income disparity between the wealthy and everyone else.
So while the rich are getting richer, the middle class is feeling squeezed. What about those at the very bottom, the bottom 50%?
Unfortunately, their share of the national income has shrunk significantly since 1993. There was a slight temporary rise around 2018 to 2020.
Right, during that economic slowdown.
Yes, and this actually highlights the pro-cyclical nature of inequality. Think of it like this. When the economy's booming, the wealthy tend to ride that wave the highest, gaining the most. But when there's a recession, they also tend to fall the hardest. But does that actually level the playing field in the long run? That's debatable.
It seems like even during tough times, the underlying trend of growing inequality persists.
That's what the data suggests. And this brings us to another significant piece of the puzzle, wealth inequality.
Okay, we've covered a century of income inequality in India with all its ups and downs, but I have a feeling this is where the story takes an even sharper turn.
You're right, fasten your seatbelts, because when we look at wealth inequality, the findings are even more stark. We're about to explore the extreme concentration of wealth at the very top of the Indian economic pyramid.
All right, bring on the wealth inequality deep dive. I'm ready to see just how extreme this concentration at the top really is.
Get ready for some striking numbers. The research shows that wealth inequality in India has skyrocketed since 1991, mirroring the trends we saw in income inequality. Just to give you a sense of the scale, in 2022 to 2023, the average wealth held by the top 1% in India was a staggering 54 million rupees. That's 40 times greater than the average wealth of the typical Indian.
40 times. It's hard to even wrap my head around that kind of difference. What about the bottom 50% and the middle 40%? Where do they stand in this picture?
The bottom 50% held an average wealth of just 0.17 million rupees, while the middle 40% had 0.96 million. Those figures really highlight the vast chasm between the wealthiest and everyone else.
It's like we're looking at two completely different realities within the same country.
That's a powerful way to put it. And it gets even more extreme when you zero in on the very top. The study found that the wealthiest 10,000 individuals in India, out of a total adult population of 920 million, held an average wealth 16,763 times greater than the average Indian. Remember that figure we started with? That's where it comes from.
It's mind-boggling to think that such a tiny fraction of the population holds such a disproportionate share of the wealth. But how did we get to this point? Can we trace this wealth concentration back through history?
Absolutely. Let's rewind to 1961, the starting point of our wealth data. Back then, the top 1% wealth share was around 13%. It stayed relatively stable until the 1990s, and then things started to change rapidly. Does that timing ring a bell?
It sounds a lot like when those economic liberalization policies kicked in the same period we saw income inequality begin to surge.
You're exactly right. From 1991 onwards, the top 1% wealth share embarked on a steep climb, reaching nearly 40% by 2023. That's a threefold increase in just a few decades. And remember how we discussed the intense concentration of income within the top 1%? Well, we see the same pattern with wealth. A huge chunk of the top 1%'s wealth is actually held by the top 0.1%, 0.01%, and 0.001%.
So it's not just the top 1% pulling away from everyone else. It's a tiny elite within that top 1% that's amassing wealth at an incredible rate. What about the other side of the equation? What's happening with the wealth shares of the bottom 50% and the middle 40%?
Sadly, their wealth shares have been steadily declining since 1991. By 2022 to 2023, the bottom 50% were left with a wealth share that was 5 times smaller than that of the top 1%. It paints a stark picture of how wealth is being distributed in India.
It's like a seesaw with the wealth of the top 1% going up as the wealth of the bottom and middle shrinks. It makes me wonder, are there any other countries that show this kind of extreme wealth disparity?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's true that India's bottom 50% wealth share is alarmingly low, but it's not actually the lowest globally. In 2022, it was comparable to China's at 6% and even higher than the 5% shares in the UK and France. The US had a shockingly low share of just 1%.
So even though things are pretty dire for the bottom 50% in India, there are other countries where things are even worse. What could explain this difference?
The study suggests that widespread land ownership in India, even if it's just small plots, could be a factor. While it might not be much, it could be providing a slight buffer for the bottom 50% compared to countries where land ownership is even more concentrated. However, we can't forget that the middle 40% in India are also experiencing a shrinking wealth share. This trend really reinforces the idea of a missing middle class in India.
It's concerning to see this kind of polarization taking shape with a small elite at the top and the vast majority struggling to keep up.
It's a trend worth paying close attention to, and this polarization becomes even more apparent when we compare how wealth and income inequality have evolved over the past couple of decades.
What do you mean by compare how they've evolved? Is there a difference in how those two types of inequality are playing out?
What's intriguing is that the gap between the top 10% income share and wealth share has actually narrowed slightly over time. But here's the catch. The gap between the top 1% income share and wealth share has actually widened.
So while income and wealth are both becoming more concentrated at the top, wealth concentration is accelerating at an even faster pace.
That's exactly it. The wealthiest individuals aren't just earning a larger share of the income, they're also accumulating wealth at an even more accelerated rate.
This is some heavy stuff. It really makes you think about the long-term consequences of these trends. Is there anything else in the study that sheds light on this disparity?
The researchers dug into what are called wealth to income ratios, which essentially show how much wealth people have compared to their income. And the findings are quite revealing. These ratios vary drastically across different segments of the Indian population.
Give me an example. How different are those ratios at the top compared to the bottom?
Well, at the lower end of the wealth distribution, wealth makes up only about 30 to 40% of income. But at the very top, get this, wealth is over 46 times greater than income.
That's mind-blowing. A difference of that magnitude really highlights the uneven playing field in India. What does this tell us about the nature of inequality?
It shows that wealth is not only highly concentrated, but it's also growing much faster than income, particularly for the elite. And this has significant implications for how we even measure and understand inequality, let alone address it effectively. We can't just focus on income. We need to look at wealth accumulation too.
Okay, so we've established that inequality in India is a complex and multi-layered issue, but what can be done about it? Are there any policy solutions on the horizon?
This study does touch upon some potential policy implications, particularly around reforming the Indian tax system. It highlights how the current tax system, when viewed through the lens of wealth, might actually be regressive.
Wait, regressive? You mean the current tax system might actually be exacerbating wealth inequality? How is it possible?
The researchers argue that the current tax structure as it stands may disproportionately benefit the wealthy, contributing to the widening gap between the rich and the poor.
So if the goal is to create a more equitable society, what kind of tax reforms could be implemented?
The study floats the idea of a super tax, specifically targeted at the wealthiest families. It suggests that this could be a way to generate significant revenue that could then be invested in critical public services like healthcare, education, and nutrition programs. These investments could, in turn, help to level the playing field and provide more opportunities for those who need them most.
It makes sense to me if those at the very top are accumulating wealth at such a rapid pace, a super tax could be a way to redistribute some of that wealth and address the imbalance. But of course, there are always different perspectives and potential downsides to consider with any policy. What are some of the arguments against such a tax?
That's a great point. Critics of a super tax argue that it could discourage investment and entrepreneurship, potentially hindering economic growth. They also raise concerns about capital flight, where wealthy individuals might move their assets to countries with lower tax rates. It's a complex debate with valid points on both sides.
It sounds like finding the right balance between generating revenue and fostering a healthy economic environment is key. But before we dive further into the policy debate, there's another important aspect we need to address: data challenges and transparency.
You're right. The researchers were very upfront about the limitations of the data available to them. They faced significant challenges with the availability and reliability of various sources, including national income accounts, data tax tabulations, and even those household surveys we've been discussing.
So how did they work around those challenges? Did they have to make assumptions or adjustments to fill in the gaps?
They used various techniques to overcome those data limitations. For example, they had to interpolate missing data points and make adjustments for inconsistencies across different sources. Despite their efforts, these data challenges likely mean that their findings represent a lower bound to the actual levels of inequality in India.
So the situation might be even more extreme than the numbers suggest.
It's certainly a possibility, and that's where the issue of data transparency becomes crucial. The researchers strongly advocate for greater transparency and access to data in India, which could paint a more accurate picture of inequality.
I remember them making some specific recommendations around data transparency. Could you remind us what those were?
They called for the consistent and regular publication of tax tabulations, enriched with more detailed information on income sources, gender, and even wealth. Right now, that level of detail isn't readily available, which limits our understanding of how wealth is distributed and how the tax system impacts different groups.
More granular data would certainly help policymakers and researchers get a better handle on the nuances of inequality. Were there any other recommendations?
They also urge the government to include questions about capital income in key surveys, like the periodic labor force surveys. Currently, these surveys don't capture this crucial information, which makes it difficult to get a complete picture of income inequality.
It sounds like a lot of the researchers' recommendations focus on giving citizens and researchers the tools they need to understand and address these complex issues. It's about empowering people with data and knowledge.
That's a great way to summarize it. Knowledge is power, and having access to accurate and detailed data is the first step toward having meaningful conversations about inequality and crafting effective policies to address it. They also highlighted the need for a caste-based census to understand how economic inequality intersects with social factors, a crucial aspect that's often overlooked.
It's clear that addressing inequality in India requires not only policy changes, but also a fundamental shift towards greater transparency and data democratization. We've covered a lot of ground today before we wrap up this deep dive. I'm curious to hear your final thoughts on this exploration of a century of inequality in India. What stands out to you as the most important takeaways?
It's been a fascinating and, at times, disheartening journey through India's economic evolution. We've seen how the landscape has transformed from the British Raj to what's being called the Billionaire Raj. We've unpacked the dramatic shifts in income and wealth distribution, the impact of policies like economic liberalization, and the growing concentration of wealth in the hands of a select few. But I want to leave you with a final thought-provoking point that gives me hope.
I'm definitely ready for a dose of hope. After all this heavy data, what's the silver lining? I'm definitely ready for a dose of hope after all this heavy data. What's the silver lining?
The study compares India's experience to China's. Both countries have seen rising inequality. But China shows us that rapid economic growth can happen without the extreme levels of wealth and income disparity we see in India today.
That's a really important comparison. It suggests that there are alternative pathways to economic growth, ones that don't necessarily lead to such a stark concentration of wealth at the top. It makes you wonder if India's current economic model is truly serving the needs of all its citizens.
Exactly. It raises crucial questions about the kind of future India wants to build, a future where a small elite controls a vast majority of the wealth, or a future that's more equitable and provides opportunities for everyone. This brings us right back to the importance of data democratization. If India wants to create a more just and balanced society, its citizens need access to the information that allows them to understand these complex issues and hold their leaders accountable.
I couldn't agree more. Transparency is essential for any meaningful discussion about inequality. It's the foundation for informed public debate and for crafting effective policies to address these challenges.
Absolutely. Transparency empowers individuals and communities to advocate for change. It allows us to ask the tough questions, challenge the status quo, and work towards a future where the benefits of economic growth are shared more equitably.
Well said. So after this whirlwind tour of a century of economic data from the British Raj to the Billionaire Raj, what are the key takeaways you want to leave our listeners with?
First, inequality in India, particularly wealth inequality, has been on a dramatic rise, especially since the 1990s. This rise is happening alongside significant economic growth, which means that the benefits of that growth are not being shared equally among all segments of society, but finally, and most importantly, there's hope.
Hope. Even with these stark trends, I'm curious to hear how you see that.
There's hope because by understanding these complex issues, by demanding greater transparency, and by engaging in informed debate, we can work towards creating a more equitable future for India. It starts with awareness, with asking the right questions, and with a commitment to finding solutions that benefit everyone, not just a select few.
That's a powerful message to end on. Knowledge is power. And by shedding light on these issues, we can empower individuals and communities to become agents of change.
Precisely. And remember, this deep dive is just a starting point. If you're interested in learning more, the full working paper and other resources are available online. I encourage you to dive in and continue exploring this important topic.
Thank you for joining us on this fascinating and thought-provoking exploration of income and wealth inequality in India. We hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you some food for thought.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you.
Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep striving for a more equitable world.